Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Don't be surprised. Stay ahead of new provider directory requirements. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping details. Today's webinar is being recorded, and an online archive of today's event will be available a few days after the session. If you have trouble seeing the slides at any time during the presentation, please press F5 to refresh your screen or Command R if you're using a Mac. You may ask a question at any time during the presentation by typing your question into the Q&A box located on the right side of your screen and pressing Enter. And finally, I'd like to remind you of AHIP's antitrust statement located just below the slide viewer. We will, as always, comply with that statement. Among other things, the antitrust statement prohibits us from discussing competitively sensitive information. We're very fortunate to have with us today Beth Bierbower, Joel White, Jennifer Forcash, and Scott Westover. Beth is a former member of Humana's product development, innovation, and executive management teams with more than 30 years of proven executive-level experience in the health insurance industry. She currently serves on the boards of Bluesprig, a provider of applied behavioral analysis therapy to individuals with autism, the American Telemedicine Association, and Quest Analytics. She is also the host of B-Time podcast. Joel is the founder of Horizon Government Affairs and executive director of the Health Innovation Alliance, an effort to expand adoption and use of health IT to improve outcomes and lower costs. He spent 12 years on Capitol Hill as professional staff, where he helped enact 9 laws and served 6 years as staff on the House Committee of Ways and Means. In her role as Senior Director of Commercial Products for Multiplan, Jennifer drives the execution of new services and service enhancements targeting commercial payers. With more than 20 years of healthcare experience, Jen has led sales and account management for multiple organizations. Scott is a seasoned executive with deep experience across the payer, provider, and regulatory space. Most recently, he served as market president for AmeriHealth Caritas, New Hampshire, where he was responsible for the plan's strategic direction, growth, and leadership. At this time, I would like to turn the floor over to our speakers. Welcome.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here. We have a terrific panel for you today, and we are going to cover a number of topics. We're going to talk about the era of consumer protections in healthcare. We're going to talk about the real world implications of this, what we can expect next, and of course, we want to save a little bit of time at the end for some questions from you, the audience. So let's get started. Many of you probably know that back in December of 2020, Congress passed the No Surprises Act as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act. Now, this act is really designed to protect people who receive services at an in-network facility but see an out-of-network provider while in that facility. Now, the act is 400 pages long, and that's a lot of material to cover, but within it is a tiny little section, Section 116. And Section 116 is called Protecting Patients and Improving the Accuracy of Provider Directory Information. Now, we haven't heard a lot from the news media about this specific section, but let me tell you, it packs the wallop, and it's a really important section, and that's what our panel of experts is going to talk about today. So you're going to hear about the regulations, the law, what it means, how we have to prepare as health plans, and what some of the best practices are that we're seeing out there. So with that, we first want to go to a poll question. So Monica, will you tee up the poll, please?
Thank you. There is a poll running now on the right side of your screen. Please make sure you're not in full screen mode so that you can participate in the poll. And that poll reads, how are you starting to plan for new systems or processes in preparation for the No Surprises Act? We have 4 choices. We are just digesting the news, or we have created a strategy team to tackle these challenges, or we're well underway in developing processes to comply with the Act, or we're waiting to see what will happen. And I will turn it back over to our speakers. Thank you.
Great. Well, it looks like we have some answers coming in there, and while these answers are in fact coming in, Joel, I'm going to ask you, is there anything that is surprising you in what you're seeing in the results of the poll?
Just looking at the polls now.
A lot of good responses that are coming back, good participation.
Yeah, I think a lot of, the rules aren't out yet, so it's encouraging that many people are, thinking about or creating, a strategy to tackle some of the upcoming challenges in this.
Right.
That's good.
All right. Well, I think. Sorry, Joel. There. So, do we have the final results, Monica?
Yes, it looks like we have for A, we're just digesting the news, we have 33%. We have created a strategy team to tackle these challenges, we have 34%. And then we have C, we are well underway in developing the processes to comply with the Act is 24%, and we're waiting to see what will happen is 11%.
Great. Thank you, Monica. And Joel, I think that is actually a good transition to you to start to share with our listeners today, a little bit more about this law, what it means, what some of the expectations are.
Yeah, thanks for that. And if we can go to the next slide. I think that one of the things that we want to keep in context here is that this surprise billing law didn't come out of nowhere. It was developed over a period of time, and it really intersects with a lot of different trajectories that we see right now, including the development of technology applications that use data that's more readily available to provide consumers additional information so that they can take better control of their health care. And that started a number of years ago, a couple decades ago actually, to really inform consumers about prices and then quality, and increasingly about which providers are in-network and not in-network, and what that might mean in terms of cost sharing for the consumer or any financial implications for the plan. And so, I think in the surprise billing arena, what we were seeing was a tale of two cities, really. The providers were arguing that insurers were increasingly cutting them out of networks and really not informing consumers about who's in network and who's out of a network. And I think that on the insurer side, they were pointing to, in some cases, very large medical bills for quote-unquote surprise services, where a patient might show up to an emergency room or for a surgery, receive a bill for a service from an out-of-network provider that was kind of shocking, right? And so the political context was members of Congress were getting barraged by both sides in this debate and discussion, and it was pretty intense lobbying. This was a big issue for a number of years here in Washington, D.C. It was in some states as well. But what happened was members of Congress decided we really need to address this issue, and so you can see a lot of compromises in this law. It was kind of viewed as a zero-sum game. If the hospitals win, the insurers lose. If the insurers win, then the hospitals lose. And kind of in between was the patient, and what kind of is the obligation on the patient, and can we relieve them of these surprise bills? And the answer is a compromise, and a compromise is not always pretty. Sausage making in Washington is not always pleasant to look at, and what we got was this law. And this law is now being implemented. It's on the books. The rules are due out. We're expecting them any day. They're under OMB for review, and so it's incredibly timely that we're doing this webinar right now, because we're going to dig into some of the issues that are going to really affect all parties here, health plans, consumers, and providers alike. So you can go to the next slide. So first of all, the important thing to know is that the consumer is held harmless here, right? Like Congress really wanted to say for a patient, we're not going to ding you if you didn't know, right? And if you didn't know in an emergency circumstance or an emergent circumstance, or if you were provided kind of bad information, we wanted to hold you harmless. Congress said that. And so, I think that's key to understanding where Congress was coming from when they crafted the law, is that consumers are going to know what will happen to them and what is their financial obligation before those things happen, right? This informed consumer concept was key and central to this law. You can go to the next slide. So what is the new requirements, right? So in this big law, very complicated, statute about how surprise bills are going to be handled, Section 116 really changes the way that provider directories have been done. Effective January 1, 2022, health plans must ensure that their provider directories are current and accurate. Okay, so that's just right around the corner. And it's important to note that that requirement is subject to some interpretation from HHS. And so there's some ambiguity in how the rules are going to get rolled out and what they're going to mean specifically for all the actors in the ecosystem. But there's got to be a regular verification of the contract status with the provider, and has to be updated at least once every 90 days. Importantly, most states expect regular updates to their provider directories about every 30 days. So there's an intersection here between federal and state law, and it applies to the commercial health plans, right? It's individual market and small and large group that are being affected here. Health plans also must respond to enrollees about a provider's network status within 1 business day, okay? And they have to retain a website directory with the contracted providers and provide relevant information like your name, your address, your specialty, your number, things like that, so that consumers, again, will know before they go who is in network and who's not in network. And so you've got to provide that in a timely way. And I think that we all know there's been challenges sometimes in getting information from providers that's up to date on a regular and timely basis. And there's a process that's outlined in the law for creating a database to handle those queries and responses. And it could get complex, and it could interact again with how states roll this out. And so this could get into its own part of sausage making, if you will, as it gets implemented, and it could get quite complex. And so understanding exactly what's required, of the health plans is very important. The only other thing I would say very quickly before we get into the rulemaking is that if the patient provides documentation that they received and relied upon incorrect information about a provider's network status, then the plan can't impose the out-of-network cost sharing, okay? And they can't impose the out-of-network co-pays, co-insurance, or deductibles. And that's so really important in terms of the financial obligation here. And secondly, obviously, if the provider doesn't respond to the health plan for the provider directory, they can get swept out. And so, a plan needs to be very careful about how this might impact their network adequacy requirements in order to be compliant with all rules and regulations. So, but on the rulemaking side, like I said, we're expecting rules imminent. There's 2 tranches. One is going to come out in just a couple days, supposed to be by July 1st. And the second one by the end of the year, but this is an implementation date of December 31, end of the year, so for a full year start in January 1, 2022. And there's a lot of issues in this law. I don't want to downplay how big this law was. It handled a lot of very complex issues. It took years to pull together. And a lot of time what happens when there's a complex issue in front of Congress is they punt. They send it to the regulator, and the regulator in this case will design the rules that implement this system, and they're going to make decisions about how that system works. And so once those rules get out, we're going to have to cut through the fluff and go to the bone and figure out what are the actual requirements, how does that affect you, and if it's a negative, you're going to want to weigh in with the regulator and say, this doesn't work for us, or this needs to be addressed. But it's a very complex, I think, set of rules that will come out, and it's going to be very interesting to see how stakeholders respond. The other thing I want to highlight is that, remember, this law was really viewed as a zero-sum game by the major players involved, and as they battled in Congress, we're going to expect them to battle with the regulators. and try and shape the regulation in ways that really benefit them. So again, something that we're expecting and anticipating soon. So you can go to the next slide. In terms of Medicare, Medicaid, commercial, remember this is primarily for the fully insured and self-insured plans, individual and group markets. I think that on the Medicaid side, will largely be governed by the states. Many states already use a process. For Medicare, there are program rules around Medicare Advantage and the guidance around the Medicare Advantage directories, and there's many of the plans already use tools to disclose information and help consumers make informed choices about their products. So on the commercial side, this is really the biggest impact. It's going to impact all plans on the commercial market. As I said, there's depending on how these rules get implemented, there's an intersection between federal and state, perhaps, that will need to be ironed out and could get very complex. And depending on how it gets done, it could be very confusing for consumers in plans, because if there's some ambiguity, let's say around the 90-day, and a patient has surgery scheduled for the 91st day, and that provider doesn't submit, and you go into the 91st day surgery, is the provider in network, out of network? What then is the cost sharing requirement, and how does that affect the out-of-pocket costs for the consumer? So it's a big deal and a big issue, and that's important because most lives are in the commercial market, right? So you can go to the next slide. So long-term and short-term issues here. I think that for one of the challenges is that in the short term we need to figure out how consumers are made harmless, and that involves there will be some surprise bills that basically get eaten by the plan. There'll be some that get eaten on the provider side. How that affects costs and premiums, I think, is yet to be determined. It's subject to a process that's complicated, it's arbitration driven, and remains to be seen how that all will work out. But certainly we don't know yet, and so it's going to have to kind of work through that legal process to ensure that there's a solution in place. Secondly, I think that keeping up with the provider network issues. This is, a 90-day requirement. It's every 90 days, at least, and having a process in place, hopefully that's simple to administer and electronic and easy to put in place, are going to be important issues to hold down costs going forward, but also to address any upfront problems where a provider may not be responsive. Or if a provider is non-responsive, that it truly reflects the contract status with the plan and the network arrangement. But kind of long term, I think what we need to think about is how is this going to affect networks, and will there be more consistency in the networking process? Will that lead to lower costs and better kind of continuity for care for some consumers? And then, will that solution kind of move us towards a more transparent system, which is where I think the trajectory has been, right? Like, we want this information in front of people, again, so they can know before they go, so that if they're informed, they can make better decisions based on their individual healthcare needs, so that, they're doing smart things like staying healthy, keeping out of the emergency room, keeping out of the hospital, lowering costs, and just being well. So it's a challenging process and rule. It's going to take time to kind of get these regulations out, get them understood, and to kind of cut through the clutter. And that's hopefully what we help people do. And but I think it's important because importantly, it's going to affect costs, it's going to affect access, and it's going to affect quality in the short and long term. And with
Great,
that,
Joel, Thank you. And we're going to ask Monica to tee up the next polling question. Monica?
Thank you. Next poll is going to appear on the right-hand side of your screen. Make sure you are not in full screen mode in order to see the question and participate in it. And the poll reads, Which of the requirements are you most concerned about? And we have 4 choices. Is it establishing a provider verification process by January 1st, 2022? Is it verifying and updating your provider directory database every 90 days? Or is it updating your directory within 2 business days of receiving a provider update? Or the last choice is responding to consumer calls relating to your directory within 1 business day. So go ahead and make your choice. Thank you. I'll turn it back to our speakers.
Thanks, Monica. Jennifer, let me start with you as we see the answers to the poll coming in. What are your thoughts? What keeps you up at night?
Oh, that's a great question. I think all of it. But really, it's how you push those updates out within those 2 business days, right? It's not necessarily the 90-day verification. It's not necessarily being able to update your own system, right? But we have an independent network that our customers lease. And in those cases, how do we get those updates in the hands of clients who may not be using the search engine we host? Those are the kinds of things we're trying to figure out on our end and work with our customers on to make sure that we can assist their compliance efforts.
Got it. Thanks, Jennifer. And we know a lot of organizations rely on your organization, Multiplan, so that's really, really critical. Monica, it looks like the answers have stopped coming in, so can we summarize the poll, please?
Yes, I've gone ahead and published that poll so that the viewers can see the results on the right side of their screen. And what we have is 12% with A, establishing a provider verification process by January 1st, 2022. We have 27% more concerned with verifying and updating your provider directory database every 90 days. We have a whopping 52% with updating your directory within 2 business days of receiving a provider update, and 9% as responding to consumer calls relating to your directory within 1 business day. Thank you.
And thanks, Monica. Scott, let me toss this question to you really quickly. 52% of our participants on this webinar today are concerned about that 2 business day rule. What are your thoughts?
I'm not surprised at all to hear that, Beth. I think based on the conversations we have with our customers, that is absolutely top of mind. How do you turn around the correction in 2 business days?
Great. Well, Scott, that is actually a really good transition to Jennifer, who is going to share with us real-world implications. So, Jennifer, take it away.
Awesome. So we've talked a lot so far about provider data. And like Beth said in the beginning and Jill's indicated, that's a tiny piece of the No Surprises Act. There's still a lot of other things that we have to do as well to comply. So we'll go into some of that here. So the No Surprises Act defines a surprise bill as any bill a member may incur out of network unintentionally. Noble, right? Noble idea. So for emergency services, that includes services rendered in hospitals or standalone emergency facilities, as well as facility ancillary services rendered during an emergency, services performed post-stabilization when the patient can't be transported, and air ambulance services. It also includes ancillary services delivered in a non-emergency setting, like those rendered by anesthesiologists, radiologists, pathologists, for example, when the facility is in network but the provider is not, when that member goes in with a realistic expectation of PAR services being rendered and winds up with a non-PAR bill. So to identify surprise bills, payers will need to use a combination of CPT, HCPCS, and/or revenue codes and place of service, right? That's sort of the first challenge in all of this. What is a surprise bill and how do you identify it based on the rules? That in itself is a challenge before you even get to the other pieces. The regulation also introduces 2 new terms, the qualifying payment amount or QPA and the recognized amount or RA. The QPA is defined as a payer's prior year median contract rate adjusted for market CPI in certain geography. A lot of that is open to interpretation right now. Like we've said, there's more rules pending, right? We're hearing in the next few weeks. And so we hope we'll get some additional clarity into this concept, into how geographies are defined, et cetera. While the Act doesn't define the initial amount payers pay to the provider, so it doesn't mandate, for example, that these claims be priced at the QPA, we do expect QPA to be critical if and when a claim reaches the independent dispute resolution process. And in fact, the Act doesn't define initial payment at all. So it's up to payers to determine what methodology they want to use to arrive at what that initial payment made is to providers. Recognized amount is how member cost share is determined. So instead of basing a member's portion on the allowed amount, like we do today, right, we now have to base it on other things. So for fully insured plans in states where there's a payment standard, the recognized amount is based on that. For fully insured plans and where there's an all-payer model agreement, the recognized amount would be based on that. For self-insured plans or fully insured plans where there's no payment standard enacted at the state level, the recognized amount now becomes based on QPA. So how should payers structure their initial payment strategy to arbitrate around this tolerance requirements, right? The Act doesn't define the initial amount payers pay a provider. Payers can leave their current programs in place, or they can revise them based on what they anticipate happening down the road in post-payment negotiation or independent dispute resolution. But ultimately, the strategy for determining an initial payment amount is going to be important because it can impact both cost effectiveness and arbitration risk. Say, for example, a payer chooses to reimburse below that QPA and be inflexible during the post-payment negotiation period we know is behind that. That's a cost-effective strategy initially, but then what happens when that payer gets to arbitration? It's unlikely the ruling would be in their favor, so not only do they end up paying more in terms of reimbursement to a provider, but they end up paying the cost of arbitration as well. The opposite end of the spectrum, reimbursing above the QPA and be willing to pay even more during the post-payment negotiation strategy, likely guarantees a nice outcome at arbitration, but paying out so much on the front end isn't necessarily cost-effective either, right? And if the goal is sort of to manage the healthcare costs associated with surprise bills, that's out of alignment with that. So ideally, payers would pursue a strategy that's somewhere in the middle and that it's cost effective on initial payment amount, but reflects the client's tolerance for arbitration. The surprise bill timeline is a little bit different from what we see in other areas. So just like claims processes today, a provider submits a bill when they've rendered services, and the plan has 30 days to pay or deny that claim. Once they've done that, the provider has 30 days to raise their hand and ask to negotiate a different reimbursement than was initially rendered. When that negotiation begins, there's 30 days then to come to terms. If agreement cannot be mutually agreed upon, then either party can raise their hand and initiate an independent dispute resolution, kick off the independent dispute resolution process. They have 4 days to work together to mutually agree upon an arbitrator. If they can't do that, the Department of Health and Human Services will appoint one. From there, they have time to send in their initial their offers, and it's baseball style arbitration. 10 days to do that, and then the arbitrator has 20 days to make a determination, and then that determination is final. There are a lot of different factors to consider as well with surprise bills. The No Surprises Act is federal and, again, addresses ASO business and fully insured business in states where there are no payment standards. Right now, there are 17 states that do have those payment standards, and that's rising. For example, there were 4 states in 2020 that implemented or revised surprise bill protections, and all of them added a payment standard. While there may be variances between states, basically the methodologies used all boil down to an all-payer database, CMS, median contract rate, plan benefit limit and UCR using an impartial database. Unfortunately, payers who have both fully insured and self-insured plans have to be prepared to address both. Compliance will be difficult. Again, first you've got to identify a surprise bill, and then you have to be prepared to potentially put that bill through a different pricing strategy than you would a normal claim. At minimum, you have to use network data to calculate a QPA, to change the math on how you have to calculate a member's portion. It's now based on QPA regardless of your initial payment amount, and that could mean a change to your benefit language. Have to be strategic around that initial payment amount. Basically arrive at an amount that puts you in the least likely place to get into arbitration. You have to manage very specific timelines around these claims. If a provider raises their hand to object, then you have to manage every single exchange so that it can be packaged up for independent dispute resolutions, and also be strategic about how you negotiate during that process. You have to manage the independent dispute resolution process, and again, understand how to be strategic about your argument, and then potentially be prepared to pay costs. And you have to be able to estimate costs and produce advanced DOBs for those members who choose to go out of network, right? The Act also addresses members who have consciously made a choice to see a non-par provider. And now there's all sorts of obligations that a provider and payer have to work together to fulfill, so that patient has an estimate of what their actual cost will be. So there's a lot of pieces and a lot of challenges on compliance with this act.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. There is certainly a lot of heavy lifting that health plans are going to have to do, and we're going to have a lot of questions for you and Joel in a minute. But now I want to transition to Scott, because Scott, you're out there. You work with about 95% of the health plans that are available today, and I'm sure you've seen more than a few best practices. So I'd like to turn it over to you to share some of that with our audience, please.
Absolutely, Beth. And I'd be remiss if I didn't note the check marks I started to make, Jen, as you were talking about what happens when, right? Well, here we are, we're about to embark into the great unknown, the implementation of the No Surprises Act, and the complexity that you were just speaking of. I think everyone will be watching, especially as we get out of the gate, right? What will happen? How will rulemaking ultimately establish the implementation path that we will all pursue? Everyone will be watching. At the same time, I think it's safe to say that we'll all be preparing. So what I would like to do is talk just a little bit about some of the things that Quest Analytics has been doing in that vein of preparation. As Joel mentioned, this has been a conversation that we've been having as a nation for years. And for at least the last 3 years, Quest Analytics has been looking at what might this mean as the act actually comes together and we begin to, under the spirit of consumer protection, take a very serious stand around our provider accuracy, provider data accuracy. So this is an example that I wanted to share today, Beth, that really points to a real live analysis. This is one county out of New York using real data, a real network, and being very generous, actually. At the time we did this, we looked at provider attestation over a 1-year period. And if you think about it, that's pretty generous, considering that the No Surprises Act finally settled on every 90 days requiring that attestation. And what we found is, looking at this county and this real network, is when you removed providers from the provider directory who had not provided attestation in the time frame that we spec'd out, we saw some pretty dramatic impact, including the drive time. We saw an 8-fold increase in the distance and the time that members would have to drive to see a provider. We saw a 90% decrease in primary care availability, the access points actually shrinking 9 out of 10. And then we saw at the same time a 91% decrease in the provider market share offered by this particular carrier in this particular network. So if you go back and you look at those results and you think about the questions that they raise, they're pretty serious. You think about the increased driving distance. Will your members actually drive 8 times farther to see a provider that is in your network and in your provider directory? If 90% of the access points simply don't appear in your provider directory, what happens to wait times? And what's the impact on the 10% of the providers who are in your provider directory? How will they react? What's the opportunity there for provider abrasion? And then in the far right, thinking about that 91% decrease in primary care market share, what happens to the competitive advantage of your network? And if you think about it from the perspective of a member who has selected your plan based on their doctor being in your network, all of a sudden they go back to actually utilize services and the provider has been removed from your directory. Or someone who's trying to make a decision about which plan to select and having the misinterpretation that your network has shrunk, when really what you're doing is you're not able to reflect your providers because of this lack of attestation in that 90-day period. So just to put a very real world example out there, this is the kind of result that we may start to see as we move into January of 2022, which is just around the corner, as you could hear in Jen's voice as she talked about everything that we need to get done. Coming from the perspective of a former market president, I think it's safe to say that we would all agree very quickly that this is a big challenge. And there's a lot of different things that make this complicated. We've talked about many of them today. I'd like to focus on a couple on this screen. The first is the top right, the inaccurate data. Having worked in the systems, and Jen, you could probably attest to this, the number of teams involved, the number of systems involved, the number of different reliances that we have in the ecosystem makes it really hard to identify, hey, what's right, what's wrong, what's missing from the data? How do you know if what you're looking at is in fact accurate? It's a real challenge. And then the other area I'd bring our attention to is in that bottom row in the center box, this idea of inflated networks. At Quest, it's in our DNA to think about network adequacy and accuracy in the same breath, right? You cannot take those two things apart, because as we think about accuracy and improving accuracy, and again, I think we're all aligned that consumers deserve the most protections possible. At the same time, we have to run our businesses. So where is that balance and how do you strike it? So this is absolutely a complicated problem that frankly, all of us on this webinar, we've been tasked to solve it. So where do you start? If we just focus on all the work that needs to be done and all of the expectations that surround us, we'd probably just panic and maybe do nothing, right? So rather than doing that, I'd like us to focus on what can we control and what do we understand. And I should pause here and say, there is no magic bullet in the real world here, right? If somebody had the secret solution, we wouldn't even be having this conversation because the data would be correct and there wouldn't be this need to try to improve provider data accuracy because it would be working better. But it isn't. So we are having this conversation. And what I propose is that as I work with clients, the most productive conversations are those that acknowledge, as you can see here in the box on the left, that when you start talking about network, the assumption is that somewhere between 10 and 30% of the data in your directory is wrong. For whatever reason, those providers are no longer seeing your members. Rather than trying to figure out how do I fix all that data, how do I fix this major problem between now and January 1st, 2022, I think it puts air back into the room if we think about the process that's required. What we're really being held accountable to do is create a process that works towards the aim of the No Surprises Act, which is to improve consumer protection by increasing over time the accuracy of our provider data. And the way we do that is by understanding more about the data itself, by understanding what data that we have is valid, when was it last attested to. And as we have some confidence in that set of providers that we have good data around, we promote them in our provider directories. We rise them literally to the top of the search. At the same time, we'll have providers that we have less confidence in the data, or we have been unable to contact, or we don't know the age of the last attestation. and we demote those providers. We push them further down into the search. And as we do those two things together, it's safe to say that we'll create an inventory, right? And that's where you get into putting together your plan to fix the data. And when you have that inventory in front of you, you have an opportunity, if you connect the provider data accuracy and your network adequacy together, you can start to prioritize which providers do I need to reach out to most urgently so I can get them back in the directory so they can see my members and I can meet my promise. I think that, again, having been on the other side of the desk as a health plan president, I think about the conversations, the hard conversations that I've had with regulators, with auditors. And every time I could sit down and say, listen, I understand my situation. I realize the problem. Here's my plan to address the problem. And here's how I propose to show improvement over time. Those conversations went really well. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is focusing on how we're going to promote, demote, and improve over time our overall provider data accuracy to prevent the surprise billing from taking place and having Jen have to do less of that work that she was talking about a moment ago. So how do you get started? Well, one of the things we do is we encourage transparent conversations within your organization. And they might look something like this. Now, every organization is a little bit different, but essentially what we're talking about is kicking off a series of discussions that get progressively more detailed. They might start with, does everybody understand our baseline? Where are we actually starting today? How are we verifying our data? What is our frequency of that verification? What's the baseline? And then moving into the next conversation about how do the systems work? How does the process work? How do we actually ingest that data? How do we leverage updates across all of our lines of business so that we have our arms around our provider data accuracy condition? Then you move into, what do we know? That gray box. What do we actually know to be true? And that's where you start thinking about, do we know for certain what the age of our data is? Do we know how we track our verified data? And do we have a process that we're all using consistently across the organization? And once you've had those three conversations, that's where you start to move into, okay, what is our process that we're going to engage in so we can explain to anyone who wants to hear, and I think we'll all be explaining ourselves as this act rolls out starting in January, how do we know that we have a process in place that will over time actually improve our accuracy without sacrificing our adequacy so that we can run our business? Finally, as you're having those conversations, that's when you put together your actual plan. And there's some steps on your screen here that may be helpful. Like, what is the awareness? That's what we just talked about. What's the conversation internally in your organization? Then the planning process. What are we actually going to do? And probably phase 3 is the hardest part. It's the doing, right? It's coming out of that planning process and saying, okay, now we're actually going to do this. And that might require that we do things differently. It may also require that you identify, who are you going to work with? Who's your business partner going to be? And the time to be making that decision is right now. And I think what you're looking for is, how are you going to combine the internal resources that you have today with an external business partner who can help bring that process into the execution phase on the far right. And really keeping in mind the whole time that what you're trying to do is be able to demonstrate that you have a process in place, that you get it, that you're going to be able to talk with a regulator and explain that you have a process that allows you to demonstrate improvement over time that reduces the likelihood of your members being caught in that trap that we've been talking about today. So I'll leave you with this thought. As you sit down and you have those conversations, everybody can use resources. And I would encourage you to visit nobodylikessurprises.com. It's a landing page that we have in place that simply provides information, regardless of how you choose to tackle this problem, there'll be resources here that I'd encourage you to review, organize your thinking, and really understand how your organization will, on January 1st, 2022, be able to say, you know what, we have a process in place and we are prepared. So Beth, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Really appreciate this. And we have so many questions that are coming in from the audience that I think we want to just jump in. Monica, is there anything that our audience needs to know about putting questions in the chat?
Yes, thank you. At this time, we are going to address some questions that came in during the presentation. As a reminder, you can ask your question by typing your question into the Q&A box located on the right side of your screen and click enter. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Monica. Well, let's take our first question. It's going to be for Scott. And Scott, this is from Julie, and the question is, the challenge we face, our providers do not alert payers of their address changes. We send an annual update request, and many times it's our members that share the new address information. That's for sure, right? So how are we going to handle this, Scott?
Well, I think part of it will become a little bit easier. I'm optimistic. I think it will get a little bit easier as we start to actually implement this act and you start to see actions taken like the ones we just described, Beth, where there is a consequence for not verifying or attesting to your data that results in that commercial volume not being able to select you because you're not in that directory. And again, that's the requirement right now in the No Surprises Act as we expect it to be implemented, that we will have to start removing providers from the directory. And I don't think that that's been the case until now. So I expect that will get some attention.
For sure. Some providers are going to get a little bit of a wake-up call with this new legislation. So we have another question. Joel, this question is going to be for you. It's from Cheryl. And Cheryl tells us the law requires that a database of the provider directory information be established and displayed on the plan's website. There has been some confusion as to whether this database is synonymous with existing online provider directories, or is it just a totally new database? So what are your thoughts, Joel?
Yeah, good question, and remains to be seen in the regulatory structure. I think that there's the CMS provider directory and the interoperability regulations, but we're expecting new requirements to be released as part of the regulations that we're expecting any day now, and I think that the process, it's important to understand, is new. The communication between the plan and the provider, as envisioned by this law, is kind of like jointly on both parties, right? And that's kind of maybe a new process that's going to be spelled out in the regulations a little bit better, and the database is part of that process. But what's really important to understand is that it's on the plan to verify the database and the data and to make the updates and to notify, and it's on the plan to deal with the financial implications of any errors, like eating the out-of-network costs when you make a mistake by listing someone who's in network. So there is my expectation is that a fair amount, or if not all of it, will be new process because it's this new statute.
This is going to be quite a heavy lift for health plans and providers alike. Jennifer, I'm going to tee this next question up for you because this should be right up your alley. This is from John, and he asks, are payers required to include providers from contracted networks in their own provider databases? In other words, do you need to store the full multi-plan database in your own system?
Yeah, no, we don't interpret the requirement as that. We have to make it available to you. We expect that certain clients will choose to do just what you said, take that provider data and integrate it into whatever their application is. Otherwise, we expect, like normal, that you could link to our web searches and things like that, our databases, and have it separate as long as somebody could get to it from ours. Or get to our website from yours.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. And this next question is for you as well, because this addresses what people were most concerned about, and that is the 2 days. So Danielle is asking, how do you interpret the 2 days? And what if a committee, oh gosh, all of the committees we have at health plans, right? What if a committee has to approve all the changes? And what if the event triggers a new contract for your policies? How do you meet that standard?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely all great questions. And I think we're still all trying to figure all of that out as well. I think when it's clear cut, getting an update into a system in 2 days isn't probably a challenge that's insurmountable, right? In the grand scheme of all of this, we can do that. Where we see the biggest challenge is then how do you push that out, right? Again, if you've got, in our case, in Multiplan's case, you've got folks to whom we push out data on a monthly, weekly basis. How do you change that to 2 days? It's near impossible. So I think as an industry, we have to be more creative around using things like API connectivity, things that once a database is updated, speed up that process for how somebody comes into your data and pulls it. Those are the kinds of things we're looking at Multiplan. But agree, there's so many complexities. Updating a provider record, it's often not as simple as, well, this provider's deceased, pull them out of network, right? That's straightforward. Oftentimes, though, those aren't the types of updates we're talking about. And I think that's some of what we'll have to figure out as more information is released and more rules are established.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Now, Joel, I have another one for you that came in from Pete. And Pete asked, other than removing from the directory, is there any plan to hold the provider accountable for attesting an accuracy of that attestation?
Yeah, we expect that's going to be spelled out in the regs too. I think that what CMS envisions is kind of a two-way street, that there needs to be truth on both sides of the ledger, and that if a provider is submitting inaccurate data to the health plan, that there's a process for resolving any inaccuracies and disputes. I got to say that having been a veteran of writing the Medicare Part D law and then helping to implement it, this is going to get bumpy, right? Like we're going to expect some air turbulence here. So fasten your seatbelt, okay? And as these challenges come up, like what we advise our clients is document them. Start your own database or your own list, right? And there's going to be a regulator put in charge of responding to all of these questions that come up. And either we, kind of go in and talk to the powers that be to help resolve some of those issues, or you just kind of contact the help desk and submit your ticket and see if you can get it resolved, or rely on, experts like Quest to kind of, go in and help aggregate the challenges as well. But I think we can expect a lot of these issues to try to be resolved up front in the proposed regulations and the final rules. But then there'll be ongoing turbulence that we're just going to need to document and take to the regulators and make our best case.
And if I could just add on there, for folks who are using network partners or vendors, you should be able to rely wholly on those partners for compliance. And hopefully, I know at Multiplan we have been actively working on this component of the Act as well as all of the other components for probably 18 months now, and hopefully other vendors that you're using are as well. But if you haven't already, you should be initiating those conversations with your vendors and trying to understand what they do and what they're going to do and how they're going to comply. Because at the end of the day, while they are an integral part of their process, you are on the hook for compliance. So it's important that you be in lockstep with them throughout.
Thanks, Jennifer. And this is really important. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat about this. So Scott, I'm going to ask you to weigh in as well about this exclusion from the directory and attestation process.
I appreciate that, Beth. Yeah, there's been some confusion. The way the law is written today, the consequence is to be removed from the provider directory. It is not to be thrown out of the actual network itself. So it's about removing the provider from the directory. And I believe the term, and Joel, you may know off the top of your head, not to put you on the spot, but I believe what they talk about is the public-facing information that shares the information about which providers are included. And so that's very different than terminating a provider's contract. We're talking about removal from the public-facing directories. Did I get that right, Joel?
That's correct. Yep.
Great. And Scott, your slide where you showed what happens with the provider network when somebody fails to complete their attestation. So Gray is asking, in this example, is the insurance company essentially overstating their provider network? Are they just, trying to make it look better than it is? What was really going on there that was driving those results?
Sure. I think it'd be unfair to say it was a malicious intent to overstate their network footprint. My suspicion is that this is, and again, I'm coming at this from having been knee deep in the provider data firsthand. It's what happens when the provider data accuracy, it's neglected over time. And that's really, there's not been consequence for attestation and validation. And that's the outcome that you see. I wouldn't say it's malicious. I will say that in our conversations with regulators, they are absolutely watching the integrity of the network adequacy submissions and doing this kind of analysis as well, because it's a promise. It's a promise that a health plan makes. This is the network that is available to render care for my members or my beneficiaries. And while we're talking about commercial business today and the No Surprises Act, other lines of business in government space are also watching the No Surprises Act under that same motivation of consumer protection, truth in advertising, if you will.
Well, I think that with the introduction of this act, you're going to have all your top executives at the health plans really focusing on this. So this is going to get quite a bit of attention. Joel, another question for you. And this is from TJ, and TJ is asking, legislation requires that a plan verifies, in quotes, and updates the provider directory information. Do you have a sense for what verifies really means in practice?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but I think that's going to be spelled out in the regulation. The specific language is you've got to have a procedure, for removal, and according to, based on if you're unable to verify such information during a period specified by the plan or the issuer. And verify, in this sense, what Congress meant was there's specific information that's required to be part of the database and the publication, and if you can't verify that information, then you're to remove. But that process of verification, I think, again, is owned by both parties. It's incumbent on both parties to be a part of that communication process. Will be spelled out in the regulation, but again, it's up to the plan to do the ongoing verification of the veracity of the information.
Thank you. And now this one, Scott, is for you, and this is from Sean. And Sean says, in my experience, attested data does not necessarily mean more accurate data. Can you talk about some other ways to address accuracy?
That is a great point. You can get an attestation that just perpetuates the error, right? So one of the ways that you think about this differently today is what is, again, that process, and what's the pressure test that we're going to build in during the attestation that we can put dates with things. We can look at other data around when have claims been processed. There are things you can do in the process itself to go beyond just saying, is this correct or not? It's really a much more dynamic relational process to pressure test the information that you are certifying. It's a great question.
I think it's a very, very good question as well. And this, I mentioned a heavy lift for health plans, but for providers as well, because they're dealing with multiple entities and trying to get similar data, but not necessarily the exact data. So there's going to be some opportunity here for the right type of organizations to help providers as well. Joel, we have another question for you, please. And this is from Pete, and it says, let's see, has it been outlined that the provider will actually review our information and verify and change it, or will be acceptable just for the provider to simply send us their roster, which may or may not be accurate? And I think you sort of alluded to this just a minute ago, Joel.
Yeah, so the law goes down through a process, and it's the update of the directories, the verification, the process for removal, and then the updates and changes and the response to the consumer within the specified timeframes. And then the online standard and the print directory standard. But it all again is that process itself will be detailed by the regulations. And I think that if there's going to be different standards, I think, or different processes, I should say, for solo docs, group practices, facilities, and there'll be commonalities and similarities between them, but the processes may vary a little bit if it's a large group practice, for example, and there'll be perhaps some special rules around how that is done versus if you're just a solo doc.
Well, thank you, Joel, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and I want to mention this really important website that's a resource for everybody, and it is nobodylikessurprises.com. It's got a lot of terrific information out there to help answer your questions, and with that, I am going to toss it back to Monica.
Thank you. Thank you for that great presentation and for sharing your thoughts. Thank you to the audience for participating in today's webinar. This concludes today's presentation. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the day.